The sun hung low over the New Mexico desert when Marcus Thorne first saw the smoke rising from the canyon below. He had been tracking a wounded elk for the better part of the day, following blood spots and broken branches through the harsh terrain that had become his solitary world. 5 years of living alone in the wilderness had taught him to read the signs of the land, to move like shadow through places where lesser men would perish, and to trust his instincts above all else. The smoke was wrong. Not the clean, purposeful smoke of a cooking fire or the dark billows of a wildfire, but something in between. The erratic, desperate smoke of structures burning where they shouldn't be. Marcus left the elk trail and made his way carefully to the canyon rim, his rifle held ready and his senses alert for any sign of danger. What he saw below made his blood run cold. A small cluster of traditional Apache dwellings had been set ablaze, their buffalo hide walls sending acrid smoke into the desert air. Bodies lay scattered in the dust, and even from his elevated position, Marcus could see the terrible efficiency with which the attack had been carried out. This had not been a battle, but a massacre. Movement caught his eye, and he saw them. 5 men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, their clothes the rough garb of outlaws and desperados. They were systematically searching the burning camp, overturning pottery and tearing through personal belongings with the casual cruelty of scavengers. Marcus recognized the type: border raiders who preyed on isolated settlements, taking what they could steal and destroying what they couldn't carry. But it was the 6th figure that made Marcus's jaw clench with fury. An elderly Apache woman, her hair white as winter snow, knelt in the center of the destruction, with her hands bound behind her back. One of the raiders stood over her, his pistol drawn and pointed at her head, while another rifled through a collection of leather pouches that had been scattered from what appeared to be a medicine bundle. "Where's the gold, old woman?" The man with the gun was shouting, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "We know your people trade with the miners. We know you got payment for your witch doctoring." The woman raised her head, her face serene despite the violence surrounding her. When she spoke, her voice was steady and unafraid. "I am Naalnish, keeper of the healing ways. I have no gold, only the knowledge passed down from my grandmothers." The raider backhanded her across the face, the sound of the blow echoing off the canyon walls. "Don't give me that savage nonsense. Every Apache hideout has a stash. Tell us where it is, or I'll put a bullet in your head and burn what's left of this place to the ground." Marcus had seen enough. These were not soldiers following orders or settlers defending their homes. These were murderers and thieves, and they were torturing an elderly woman for treasure that probably didn't exist. His hands moved to his rifle without conscious thought, the familiar weight of the weapon grounding him in the moment. He was 1 man against 5, but Marcus had advantages they didn't know about. The high ground, the element of surprise, and most importantly, the kind of focused rage that comes from watching evil triumph over innocence. He had been a different man once, before the war, before the fever that took his family, before the years of self-imposed exile that had turned him into a ghost haunting the borderlands. But some things could still call him back to humanity, and the sight of an old woman being brutalized was one of them. Marcus's first shot took the man holding the gun to Naalnish's head, the heavy bullet spinning him around and dropping him into the dust. The sound of the rifle echoed through the canyon like thunder, and the remaining raiders wheeled their horses in confusion, trying to locate the source of the attack. "Up there!" one of them shouted, pointing toward the rim. "On the ridge!" They returned fire, their pistols cracking uselessly at the distance, while Marcus worked the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency. His second shot caught a raider in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle, while his third went wide as the remaining men spurred their horses toward cover. The bandits were not cowards, Marcus realized with grim satisfaction. They were regrouping, trying to flank his position, and they had enough experience to know that 1 rifleman could not cover all the approaches to the canyon rim. If they could get close enough, their superior numbers would tell. Marcus abandoned his elevated position and began working his way down into the canyon, using the broken terrain and scattered boulders for cover. The raiders were skilled, but they were also angry and careless, their voices carrying as they coordinated their attack. Marcus used their noise against them, moving like a hunting cat through the landscape he had learned to read like a book. He caught the first flanking rider as the man rounded a cluster of rocks, putting a bullet through his chest before he could raise his weapon. The second rider was more cautious, dismounting and using his horse for cover, but Marcus had anticipated the move and was already in position. His shot took the man in the leg, and when he fell, Marcus was on him with his knife before he could cry out. The remaining two raiders had taken cover behind the burning ruins of the Apache camp, using the smoke as concealment. Marcus could hear them arguing, their voices tight with fear and frustration. They had expected an easy target, an isolated settlement with no protection, and instead they had walked into a killing ground. "We need to get out of here," one of them was saying. "This ain't worth dying for." "Like hell," came the reply. "We came here for that gold, and we ain't leaving without it. Besides, it's just one man. We can take him." Marcus smiled grimly. They were wrong on both counts. There was no gold, and they had already proven they couldn't take him, but their greed would keep them here, and that would be their downfall. He circled wide, using the smoke and the terrain to mask his approach. The elderly woman, Naalnish, was still kneeling where they had left her, her hands bound but her bearing unbroken. She had witnessed the entire gun battle with the calm acceptance of someone who had seen too much violence in her long life. When Marcus was close enough, he whistled softly, the sound of a canyon wren that would seem natural to anyone not listening for it. Naalnish's eyes found his, and she nodded slightly, understanding passing between them without words. The attack came swift and brutal. Marcus emerged from the smoke like an avenging spirit, his rifle barking twice in rapid succession. The first raider died before he knew what hit him, while the second managed to get off a wild shot that went wide before Marcus's blade found his throat. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the crackling of the dying fires and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Marcus stood among the bodies of the raiders, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, the smell of gunpowder and blood heavy in the air. "It is finished," Naalnish said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking final words over the dead. Marcus moved to free her bonds, his hands surprisingly gentle as he worked at the rawhide that had cut into her wrists. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse. "The body heals," she replied, rubbing circulation back into her hands. "The spirit endures, but you, warrior, you carry deeper wounds than any I have seen today." Marcus stepped back, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "I'm no warrior. Just a man who couldn't stand by and watch." Naalnish rose slowly, her movements careful but dignified. She was smaller than he had expected, her frame bent with age, but there was something in her presence that seemed to fill the space around her. "You are Marcus Thorne," she said, and it was not a question. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "How do you know my name?" The spirits whisper of many things to those who know how to listen. They speak of a white man who walks the desert like a ghost, who has forgotten how to live among his own people. They say he carries the weight of the dead, and that his heart is a stone that will not warm. Marcus turned away, unwilling to meet her knowing gaze. The spirits talk too much. "Perhaps," Naalnish said, moving to examine the scattered remains of her medicine bundle. "But they also say that stones can be warmed by the right fire, and that ghosts can remember how to be human again." She began gathering the scattered pouches and bundles, her movements methodical despite the destruction around them. Marcus watched her work, noting the careful way she handled each item, the reverent manner in which she sorted through the tools of her trade. "Your people," Marcus said finally. "Are there others?" Naalnish's face grew grave. "These were the last of my band, the elders and the sick who could not make the journey to the reservation. They stayed with me because I am the keeper of the healing ways, the guardian of knowledge that must not be lost." She gestured to the bodies scattered around the camp. "Now they are with their ancestors and I am alone." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, a recognition of kindred solitude. "Where will you go?" "There is nowhere to go," she replied simply. "My place is here, with the bones of my people and the sacred sites of my ancestors. If the raiders return, or others like them, I will meet them with dignity. They'll kill you. All people die, Marcus Thorne. The question is whether we die with honor or with shame." Marcus looked around the destroyed camp at the evidence of senseless violence and cruelty. This wasn't honor, this was murder. "Yes," Naalnish agreed. "But your actions today were different. You chose to stand between the strong and the weak, between the cruel and the innocent. That is the choice that defines a man's spirit." They worked together through the afternoon, preparing the dead for burial according to Apache custom. Marcus had no knowledge of the proper rituals, but he followed Naalnish's lead, his movements respectful and careful. As they worked, she told him about each person they tended, their names and their stories, their contributions to the small community that had sheltered her. "This was Huskai," she said, gently arranging the clothing of an elderly man who had died defending the camp. "He was a great hunter in his youth, a provider for his people. In his old age, he became a storyteller, keeping the old tales alive for the children. And this," she continued, moving to a woman whose grey hair was streaked with blood, "was Desba, my cousin and my closest friend. She was a master weaver, and her baskets were sought after by traders from many tribes. She chose to stay with me rather than go to the reservation because she said the spirits of her ancestors lived in this canyon." Each story was a small tragedy, a life cut short by violence and greed. But Marcus began to understand that Naalnish was not just mourning the dead. She was ensuring that their memories would survive, that their contributions would not be forgotten. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, they finished their grim work. The bodies had been prepared according to tradition, wrapped in whatever cloth could be salvaged and arranged with the possessions they would need for their journey to the spirit world. "Tomorrow we will take them to the burial ground," Naalnish said, her voice weary but determined. "It is in the high places, where the spirits dwell closest to the earth." Marcus nodded, understanding that he was being invited to participate in something sacred. "I'll help you." That night, they made a small fire away from the destroyed camp, sharing what food Marcus had in his pack and water from a spring that bubbled up from the canyon floor. They spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts, but there was a companionship in their silence that neither had experienced in years. "Why do you live alone?" Naalnish asked eventually, her voice soft in the darkness. Marcus stared into the flames, seeing memories that he had tried for years to forget. "I had a family once, wife, 2 children. The fever took them during the war, while I was away fighting. When I came home, there was nothing left but graves and empty rooms." "And you blame yourself." "I should have been there, should have protected them." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Instead, I was off playing soldier, fighting in a war that didn't matter to anyone but politicians and profiteers." Naalnish was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "The heart that cannot forgive itself is like a wound that will not heal. It poisons the whole body, makes the spirit sick. Some wounds are too deep to heal. Perhaps, but some wounds, if tended properly, can become sources of strength rather than weakness. The broken bone that heals becomes stronger than it was before." Marcus looked at her across the fire, seeing the wisdom in her ancient eyes. "And how does one tend such a wound?" "By choosing to live in service of life rather than in service of death. By protecting the innocent rather than punishing the guilty. By building rather than destroying." She gestured toward the canyon around them. "Today you chose life. You chose to stand between evil and innocence, and in doing so, you honored the memory of those you could not save." They slept on opposite sides of the fire, Marcus wrapped in his bedroll and Naalnish covered by a blanket he had given her. But sleep came fitfully, troubled by dreams of violence and loss, of choices made and unmade. Marcus woke before dawn to find Naalnish already up, performing what appeared to be a morning ritual. She faced the east, her arms raised toward the lightening sky, her voice soft as she spoke in Apache to the rising sun. There was something deeply peaceful about the sight, a connection to the natural world that Marcus had lost somewhere in his years of wandering. They buried the dead that morning, carrying the wrapped bodies up a narrow trail to a place where the canyon opened onto a high mesa. The burial ground was ancient, marked by cairns and symbols that spoke of countless generations who had come here to lay their loved ones to rest. Marcus helped dig the graves, his hands blistered and bleeding by the time they were finished, but he felt no inclination to complain. As they worked, Naalnish spoke of the old ways, of the beliefs that had sustained her people through centuries of hardship and change. "We believe that the dead do not truly leave us," she said, as they lowered the last body into the earth. "They become part of the land, part of the wind and the rain, and the growing things. In this way they continue to care for those who come after." Marcus found comfort in the idea, in the notion that death was not an ending, but a transformation. He thought of his own family, wondered if they too had found a way to continue caring for those they had left behind. When the burials were complete, they returned to the canyon to salvage what they could from the destroyed camp. Much had been lost to the fire, but some things had survived. Pottery vessels, tools, and most importantly, the contents of Naalnish's medicine bundle. These she handled with particular care, explaining their uses and significance as she sorted through them. "This is blessed sage," she said, holding up a bundle of dried leaves. "It cleanses the spirit and drives away evil influences. And this," she continued, showing him a small pouch of powder, "is made from the bark of the sacred willow. It eases pain and reduces fever." Marcus watched her work with growing fascination. This was knowledge that had been passed down through generations, refined and perfected over centuries of practice. "You're a doctor," he said finally. "I am a healer," she corrected. "Doctors treat the body. Healers treat the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. And what would you prescribe for a man who has forgotten how to live?" Naalnish looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. "Purpose," she said without hesitation. "A man needs something to protect, something to care for, something that depends on him for its survival." That evening, as they sat by their fire eating the rabbit Marcus had shot, they heard the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. Marcus reached for his rifle, but Naalnish placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. "Listen." The hoofbeats had a different rhythm than those of the raiders, more measured and purposeful. As the riders came into view, Marcus could see that they were Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. But they moved with the discipline of men under strong leadership, not the chaotic violence of bandits. The leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, his bearing regal despite the simple nature of his clothing. He dismounted and approached their fire with the formal dignity of one accustomed to command. When he spoke, it was in rapid Apache, his voice carrying the authority of unquestioned leadership. Naalnish rose and answered in the same language, her words formal and respectful. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the discussion. Marcus understood none of it, but he could sense the emotional undercurrents, the grief and anger that lay beneath the formal exchange. Finally, the leader turned to Marcus, his dark eyes measuring and intense. When he spoke, it was in carefully accented English. "I am Victorio, war chief of the Warm Springs Apache. The woman tells me you defended her against the raiders, that you risked your life to save hers." Marcus nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Victorio said firmly, "you did what few men would have done. You chose to stand with the innocent against the guilty, to protect the weak against the strong. This is the mark of a true warrior. I'm not a warrior, Marcus protested. I'm just a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Victorio smiled, an expression that transformed his stern features. A warrior is not defined by his weapons or his victories, but by his choices. Today, you chose honor over safety, justice over convenience. That makes you a warrior, whether you accept the title or not. The Apache leader gestured to his men, and they began to dismount, their movements suggesting a longer stay than Marcus had anticipated. We have come to honor the dead, and to thank the man who avenged them, Victorio continued. But we have also come to offer you something that has never been offered to a white man before. Marcus felt his heart begin to race, though he wasn't sure why. What kind of offer? Victorio looked at Naalnish, who nodded slightly. The grandmother has told me of your conversation, of your willingness to help her tend the burial sites and preserve the old ways. She has also told me of your loneliness, your search for purpose. He paused, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. We offer you a place among us, a chance to serve something greater than yourself. The implications were staggering. Marcus looked around at the assembled warriors, seeing acceptance in their faces where he'd expected suspicion or hostility. I don't understand. My people have been scattered by the white man's government, Victorio explained. Some have gone to the reservation, where they slowly die of despair and disease. Others have chosen to fight, to resist, until the last breath leaves their bodies. But there is a third way, a path that requires both courage and wisdom. Naalnish stepped forward, her voice adding weight to the chief's words. There are sacred sites throughout this territory, places where the spirits of our ancestors dwell. The government would destroy them or allow them to be desecrated by those who do not understand their significance. But if they were protected by someone the authorities would not suspect, someone who could move freely in both worlds. Marcus began to understand. You want me to be a guardian? More than that, Victorio said. We want you to be a bridge between our worlds, a protector of the sacred places and the knowledge they contain. It would be dangerous work, lonely work, but it would also be meaningful work. Marcus thought of his years of aimless wandering, of the emptiness that had filled his days since his family's death. Then he thought of the morning's burial ceremony, of the peace he had felt in participating in something sacred and ancient. What would it involve? You would travel throughout the territory, visiting the sacred sites and ensuring their protection. You would learn the old ways from keepers of knowledge like Naalnish, and you would help preserve that knowledge for future generations. When necessary, you would defend these places against those who would harm them. And in return, Victorio's smile widened. In return, you would have a family again, not of blood, but of spirit. You would have a purpose that extends beyond your own pain, a reason to live that honors both your losses and your victories. Marcus looked at Naalnish, seeing encouragement in her ancient eyes. Then he looked at the assembled warriors, men who had every reason to hate and distrust white men, but who were offering him acceptance and brotherhood. I accept, he said simply. What followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The warriors began to prepare for a ceremony that would formalize his acceptance into the tribe, not as a full member but as something unprecedented, a white man sworn to protect Apache sacred sites and traditions. As the sun set, they built a large fire in the center of the canyon, its flames reaching toward the darkening sky. The warriors painted their faces and donned their finest clothing, while Naalnish prepared medicines and sacred objects that would be used in the ritual. Marcus was instructed to bathe in the sacred spring, to cleanse himself of his old life and prepare for the new. As he lowered himself into the cold water, he felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. The ceremony itself was complex and beautiful, involving chants and dances that seemed to connect the participants to the very essence of the land around them. Marcus understood little of the specific rituals, but he could feel their power, their connection to centuries of tradition and belief. When it was his turn to speak, he found himself looking into the faces of men who had chosen to trust him with their most sacred responsibilities. "I swear by the memory of my family, by the blood of the innocent, and by the spirits of this land, that I will protect what you have asked me to protect. I will learn what you have asked me to learn, and I will honor the trust you have placed in me." Victorio stepped forward and placed his hands on Marcus's shoulders. "From this day forward, you are no longer Marcus Thorne who walks alone. You are Marcus Thorne, guardian of the sacred places, brother to the Apache people, keeper of the old ways." The warriors raised their voices in a chant that seemed to echo off the canyon walls, a sound that spoke of acceptance and brotherhood, of ancient bonds renewed and new alliances forged. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks, the first he had shed since his family's death, but these were tears of joy rather than grief. As the ceremony concluded, Naalnish approached him with a leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "This contains the medicines and tools you will need in your work," she said, "but more importantly, it contains the knowledge of how to use them. I will teach you the healing ways, the sacred songs, the proper rituals for tending the holy places." Marcus accepted the pouch with reverence, understanding that he was being entrusted with knowledge that had been passed down through generations. "I won't let you down." "I know you will not," she replied. "The spirits have shown me your heart, Marcus Thorne. It is wounded, but it is also strong. It is capable of great love and great sacrifice." In the weeks that followed, Marcus began his education in earnest. Under Naalnish's guidance, he learned to identify and prepare medicinal plants, to understand the spiritual significance of various natural phenomena, and to perform the rituals necessary to maintain the sacred sites. He discovered that the Apache worldview was far more complex and sophisticated than he had ever imagined. Every aspect of the natural world was interconnected. Every plant and animal had its place in a vast web of relationships that extended from the earth to the sky. The sacred sites were not just places of worship, but focal points where these relationships were strongest, where the spiritual and physical worlds intersected. The white man sees the land as something to be owned and exploited, Naalnish explained, as they visited a spring that was sacred to her people. But we see it as something to be honored and protected. We are not its masters, but its guardians. Marcus began to understand that his new role was not just about protecting specific locations, but about preserving an entire way of understanding the world. He was becoming a keeper of wisdom that the dominant culture sought to destroy or ignore. His first test came sooner than expected. Word reached them that a mining company was planning to begin operations near a sacred mountain, one of the most important sites in Apache cosmology. The legal paperwork was already in place, the equipment was being moved into position, and the local authorities had no interest in the concerns of a scattered tribe. Marcus rode to the site alone, his mind racing with possible solutions. He could not simply attack the miners as he had the raiders. These were legal operations, backed by the territorial government. But he could not allow the desecration of the sacred mountain either. What he found when he arrived was worse than he had expected. The mining company had already begun blasting, and the sacred caves where Apache warriors had vision quests for centuries were being destroyed. The mountain itself was being torn apart in the search for silver ore. Marcus spent 3 days observing the operation, learning the routines of the miners and the supervisors. Then, on the 4th night, he began his campaign of sabotage. Equipment mysteriously broke down. Blasting charges failed to detonate. Supply wagons overturned on mountain trails. The mine foreman, a hard man named Jameson, suspected sabotage but could find no evidence. Marcus was too skilled, too careful, and too familiar with the terrain to be caught, but he was also fighting a losing battle. The mining company had resources and determination, and they would eventually succeed in their destruction. It was Naalnish who provided the solution. "You cannot fight them with force," she said when Marcus reported his limited success. "But you can fight them with knowledge." She revealed that the mining company's claims were based on a survey that had been falsified, that the true mineral deposits were miles from the sacred mountain. More importantly, she had documentation that proved the mountain had been specifically excluded from mining claims by a treaty signed 20 years earlier. Marcus took this information to the territorial capital, where he presented it to a judge who was known for his integrity. The legal battle was complex and protracted, but in the end, the mining company was forced to abandon their operations and pay substantial damages for the destruction they had already caused. "You have learned an important lesson," Victorio told him when he returned with news of the victory. "Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the truth, properly presented." Marcus nodded, understanding that his role as guardian would require many different skills. He would need to be warrior, diplomat, scholar, and healer, adapting his approach to each situation as it arose. Years passed, and Marcus became a legendary figure throughout the territory. To the Apache, he was the ghost guardian, the white man who protected their sacred places with the dedication of a true believer. To the authorities, he was a troublesome but generally law-abiding citizen who seemed to have an uncanny ability to find legal flaws in projects that threatened historical sites. To himself, he was simply a man who had found his purpose. The emptiness that had plagued him since his family's death had been filled with meaningful work, and the isolation that had driven him to the wilderness had been replaced by a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Naalnish aged gracefully, her wisdom growing even as her body grew frail. She trained Marcus not just in the practical aspects of healing and ritual, but in the deeper philosophical understanding that gave meaning to all of it. Under her guidance, he became not just a protector of sacred sites, but a bridge between cultures, helping both sides understand what they had to learn from each other. "You have become what I hoped you would become," she told him one evening as they sat by their fire, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. "A man who serves life rather than death, who builds rather than destroys." Marcus looked at his aged mentor, seeing the satisfaction in her eyes. "You saved me," he said simply. "That day in the canyon, when you told me about stones being warmed by the right fire, you saved my life." "No," Naalnish replied with a smile. "You saved yourself. I merely showed you that salvation was possible." The Apache people had not just gained a guardian for their sacred places, they had gained a champion who understood that some things were worth more than gold or silver, more valuable than individual profit or political advantage. In Marcus Thorne, they had found a man who would dedicate his life to preserving what others would destroy, to protecting what others would exploit. And Marcus had found what he had been searching for without knowing it. A family that was bound not by blood, but by shared purpose, a mission that honored both his losses and his victories, and a peace that came from knowing that his life had meaning beyond his own pain. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the voices of the ancestors and the promise of generations yet to come. The lonely wanderer had become a guardian. The broken man had become a healer, and the ghost had remembered how to live. In the end, the bandits had sought to destroy something sacred, but their attack had created something even more precious. A bond between peoples that would endure long after the last shot was fired. A testament to the truth that some things are worth fighting for, and that the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from protection of what we hold most dear.